Today we're going to talk about how energy flows in ecosystems. The goal of the goal of this video is to diagram this flow of energy using a food web, food chain, and energy pyramid. Let's begin with energy. Where does our energy come from? All of life's energy comes from the sun. Plants produce energy using sunlight when they do photosynthesis. Primary productivity is the rate at which plants make the energy. There are several factors that can increase or decrease the rate of primary productivity, like the amount of water available to the plant, the amount of sunlight available, the amount of carbon dioxide, and small amounts or trace amounts of elements in the soil like nitrogen and potassium. Now, how do living things obtain energy? Well, that depends on whether the living thing is a producer or a consumer. If it's a producer, then it produces energy by capturing sunlight or using chemicals. Examples of producers would be plants, algae, and some bacteria. Another name for producers is autotrophs. Most autotrophs obtain energy from the sun through photosynthesis. The energy from sunlight is used to power chemical reactions that make sugar. If the living thing is a consumer, then the organism has to consume other organisms for energy. The rabbit on this slide is an example. It has to consume the plant for energy. Now, there are several types of consumers. Herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. A rabbit is an example of an herbivore. Carnivores are organisms that eat only meat. A lion is an example of a carnivore. And omnivores are organisms that eat both plants and animals. A grizzly bear is an example of an omnivore. There are also detrivores. These are organisms that obtain energy from dead or decomposing matter and waste. Examples of detrivores would be vultures, crabs, and earthworms. Decomposers are organisms that cause decay and release nutrients back into the environment. Examples of decomposers would be bacteria and fungi. The mushroom in this picture is a fungus. That is why you often see mushrooms growing on dead trees in the forest. So, how does energy flow through an ecosystem? It flows in one direction from the sun to autotrophs and then to various heterotrophs. These autotrophs and heterotrophs can be assigned a level based on the order in which they receive energy, and we call these levels trophic levels. These are levels in a food chain based on how an organism gets energy. The first trophic level is always assigned to a producer or autotroph. And this brings us to the first way to diagram the flow of energy in an ecosystem. You can use a food chain. A food chain shows a single path of energy through various trophic levels. Specifically, the arrow depicts the flow of energy. This is an image of a food chain. The first trophic level is occupied by grass, which can make its own energy. That's why the grass is called a producer. The second trophic level is occupied by a grasshopper that consumes the grass for energy. That is why it's called a consumer. It is the primary consumer because it's the first consumer in this chain. The third trophic level is occupied by a shrew that consumes the grasshopper for energy. It's the second consumer in the chain, which is why it's called a secondary consumer. The fourth trophic level is occupied by an owl that consumes the shrew for energy. It's the third consumer in the chain, which is why it's called a tertiary consumer. Now, typically there are 4 to 5 available trophic levels. So consider the following example of a food chain. In this example, we have 5 trophic levels, and the direction of the arrows is very important. The arrows point in the direction of energy flow. So the energy in these seeds goes to the mouse when the mouse eats the seeds. Now that you understand how a food chain shows energy flow, you can better understand our next type of diagram, a food web. A food web is multiple food chains that are connected. A food web is useful because it shows the complex interactions within an ecosystem. There are at least 10 different food chains contained in this one food web shown on the slide. So let's practice reading this food web. What does the owl feed on? To figure it out, find an arrow pointing directly to an owl. Here's one. That arrow shows the energy from the snake being transferred to the owl when the owl eats the snake. In case that wasn't clear, let's do one more. What does the grasshopper feed on? Just find an arrow pointing directly to the grasshopper. Here's one. That arrow shows the energy from the leaves being transferred to the grasshopper when the grasshopper eats the leaves. Now let's name one primary consumer, one secondary consumer, and one tertiary consumer. To figure this out, you have to identify one food chain that is in the food web. I've outlined it here in pink. We have the leaves, the grasshopper, the frog, the snake, and the owl. The primary consumer is the first organism to consume something in this chain, and that would be the grasshopper. The secondary consumer is the second organism to consume something in this chain, and that would be the frog. And the tertiary consumer is the third organism to consume something in the chain. That would be the snake. Last question about the food web. Are there any quaternary consumers? Yes, that's a fourth level consumer. In the same food chain I've outlined, the fourth consumer would be the owl. Now let's talk about the amount of energy being passed along through the food chain and food web. When an organism eats another, they are only consuming a small part of the energy that is stored. This is because so much energy is used for life processes, such as movement and reproduction, and some energy is released as body heat. For example, seeds are using lots of energy for growth, and much of the energy it has stored has been spent. Whatever energy the mouse gets from the seeds, it will use up quickly for movement and growth and reproduction. The snake will gain energy from the mouse, but will again use that energy it needs for life. And this leads to what we call the 10% rule. Only 10% of the energy is passed on from trophic level to trophic level. Energy is typically measured in calories or joules. 1 kilocalorie is equal to 1,000 calories. So, say the seeds have 10,000 kilocalories. The mouse will get only 10% of that amount when it eats the seeds. 10% of 10,000 is 1,000. That's why I've written 1,000 kilocalories here under the mouse. Similarly, the snake will only get 10% of the energy in the mouse when it eats the mouse. 10% of 1,000 is 100. So the snake will only get 100 kilocalories when it eats the mouse. The final way to diagram energy flow in an ecosystem is what we call an energy pyramid. This is a diagram that represents the amount of energy stored in each trophic level. This is helpful because it clearly depicts the 10% rule. Producers are on the bottom, and since most of the energy is on the first trophic level, the bottom level of the pyramid is the biggest. As we move up the pyramid, each trophic level gets smaller because there is less energy available. There is another type of pyramid I'll mention. It doesn't show the amount of energy at each trophic level. Instead, it shows biomass at each trophic level. And biomass is the dry weight of living tissue found within a trophic level. This is measured in grams of organic matter per unit area. A biomass pyramid is useful because it shows the amount of potential food available for each trophic level. For example, in the biomass pyramid shown here, the trophic level with the largest biomass is the primary producers. Most of an ecosystem's dry organic matter is found in the first trophic level, which would be the producers. There have to be lots of producers, like algae, plants, and so on, in order to support an entire ecosystem with higher level carnivores. So, to sum up, you've seen three types of diagrams to model the flow of energy in an ecosystem: a food chain, a food web, and an energy pyramid.